The honor of moderating the fifth and final panel of this conference on how to make sense of Slavoj Žižek. Retrospectively, this may well become a reason to be a little nostalgic. And with that, I would now like to introduce the opening speaker of this panel on ideology. Jack Lewis studied English and visual culture at Exeter University and contemporary art theory at Goldsmiths University of London. His research interests are, among others, nostalgia, ideology, modernism, fascism and post-fascism, accelerationism, and Slavoj Žižek. In 2024, Lewis did his PhD at Cardiff University with a thesis titled A Bruising Ideology, Posthumanity and the Nostalgic Drive. His current PhD research at Cardiff University explores homesickness as a fundamental experience of modern life. Jack Lewis is particularly interested in the intersection between Slavoj Žižek's theory of ideology, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and nostalgia studies. I'm welcoming Jack Lewis as the opener of this panel with his talk titled A Bruising Ideology, which may provide us an insight into his doctoral thesis. So please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Bruising Ideology. It was in 1989. Thank you. It was in 1989 that Slavoj Žižek made his most significant and, with hindsight, most bizarre theoretical intervention with the publication of The Sublime Object of Ideology, and not simply because he resuscitated a concept generally felt by contemporaries to be outmoded. For Žižek, restoring ideology is not about positing a greater truth value behind false consciousness, as we'd be used to in Marxian terms. It's a traumatic exposition of the slips and gaps that make up any supposedly harmonious or self-consistent organization of human experience. Ideology is not the revenge of totality, but the return of the repressed. Not simply a sociological exercise, the critique of ideology becomes a truly philosophical endeavor. And I think in relation to this, the quote from Novalis that all philosophy is really homesickness, the urge to be at home everywhere, is apt here, as it will reappear later in the talk. Because in Žižek's ontology, ideology is a bruise. We are not in the thrall of ideology so much as it throbs from within. It is ever more painful and maddening the more it heals the cuts and discrepancies in our fractured experience, the more it tries to reassure us, in Žižek's quite doting term for it in The Sublime Object. It is the injury neither inside nor outside the skin, to use Carol Mavor's melancholic description of bruising. But though this strangely masochistic and romantic conception of ideology appears eternal in its tragic fatalism, it is both ever present in Žižekian political ontology, while also having a history. This history lies in the deep influence of nostalgia as a model of human desire and subjectivity on continental philosophy, from Kantian synthesis to Žižek's monumental theory of ideology as a sublime object. As is well known, nostalgia, as a portmanteau of the Greek terms nostos, or homecoming, and algos, pain, was invented by Swiss doctor Johannes Hofer in his 1688 medical dissertation on the topic of a mysterious wasting disease that had mostly affected expatriate mercenaries. Nostalgia, in Hofer's terms, and then taken up by his contemporaries in medicine, was treated as a fatal illness, breaking out in symptoms such as listlessness, melancholic disposition, starvation, sleeplessness. All these were tied into that bric-a-brac definition of nostalgia. But Hofer did not think of nostalgia, as we do today, as the private indulgence of a memory that is in some way or another significant to ourselves. For him, nostalgia was, in his words, sympathic of an afflicted imagination. Though once a faculty of human experience that was closely aligned with the faculty of memory since antiquity, under Hofer's clinical reading, imagination and memory are fatefully decoupled. Imagination instead becomes parasitic on the memories of the nostalgic sufferer. When afflicted by nostalgia, our bodies are host to the imagination as an alien dreaming, haunting and sucking the life out of us in a lethal spell of yearning obsession with return to the homeland. The consequences of this medical diagnosis, in all its romantic Gothic motifs of parasitism and possession, I argue, came to shape political and philosophical theories of alienation for centuries to come. So my research, called A Bruising Ideology, is both a history and a critique of ideology theory through an emotion, nostalgia. I examine ideology and nostalgia as a comparative, double helix movement of modernity that has deeply informed and affected post-Kantian continental philosophy, exploring the mutual origins of ideology and nostalgia in early modern medicine, early industrialized warfare, mental illness, capitalist subjectivity, and poetics. One significant historical intersection of this double movement we will look at is the original notion of ideology, coined a century later from Hofer's diagnosis by the French revolutionary ideologues as a science of ideas, exploring how this concept evolved alongside their chief theorist's role in managing the outbreaks of nostalgia disease on the battlefields of early 19th century Europe. So in short, this talk will proceed in two main parts. The first will trace a history of nostalgia from an afflicted imagination to false consciousness. The second will be a critique of Žižek's ideology theory through this history of the nostalgia disease, discussing first Hegel and the ideologue's philosophy of madness and the latter's methods to remedy nostalgia. Then the Kantian theory of the sublime in relation to Žižek's problematic jouissance of ideology, and finally the limitations of Žižek's politics through his defense of melancholia and his tragic ontology, as I see it. Significantly, nostalgia and ideology have developed along a similar historical trajectory, from an epistemological glitch of consciousness to be overcome to an ontological tragedy, a foundational wound, a constitutive absence that moves or animates human existence as such. The poet Susan Stewart calls this absence nostalgia, the absence that is the very generating mechanism of desire, in her words. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek calls it ideology, a generative matrix that regulates the relationship between visible and non-visible, between imaginable and non-imaginable. By depersonalizing nostalgia in this way from a private matter of individual dreamers to a problem of alienated consciousness, we open the space for a mysterious correlation to be drawn between death drive and nostalgia. As Susan Stewart writes in On Longing, quote, "The realization of reunion imagined by the nostalgic is a narrative utopia that works only by virtue of its partiality, its lack of fixity and closure. Nostalgia is the desire for desire." This looping of, end quote, this looping of desire, chasing a lack, as it were, echoes how Lacan formulated drive. As Lacan formulates on nostalgic sentiment in Family Complexes and the Formation of the Individual, quote, "The nostalgia for wholeness. Its liquidation leaves traces in which it can be detected, since it is this structure of the imago that remains the basis of the mental progress that has remodeled it. If we had to define the most abstract form in which it is found, we would characterize it as a perfect assimilation of totality to being. In this formula, a bit philosophical in appearance, will be recognized the nostalgias of humanity, the metaphysical mirage of universal harmony, the mystical abyss of affective fusion, the social utopia of totalitarian dependency, all derived from the longings for a paradise lost before birth, and from the most obscure aspirations for death," end quote. Lacan above describes nostalgia as a longing for an absent harmony of being, as exemplified by the amniotic oneness with the mother, experienced by the child post-mirror stage, where one first self-consciously recognizes themselves as a subject independent from the mother in the imaginary register of psychic life. The aim of this drive is to achieve the universal harmony, the wish to merge with the complete other displayed in the mirror, and in so doing, kill the imperfect dreamer of the ego. But as this nostalgic goal is impossible, Lacan later famously asserted that every drive is a death drive, since this desire both craves its own extinction while implicating subjects in repetition of excess jouissance, the overlap of suffering and pleasure. This is the bruising affect of the death drive, as it is not able to kill, but bruises the skin, leaving tender marks, a wound from yesterday that is felt today. But this is not the only place where nostalgia plays a constitutively tragic role in modeling human desire and subjectivity. Indeed, there is a curious discrepancy between the total significance nostalgic desire bears for the subject of so much of modern continental philosophy and the way the term, for its concrete historical worth, passes by with scarce attention in the work of these same modern thinkers. In Schelling, nostalgia acquires cosmological status as the deepest feature of human life, the inner gravity of temperament, in his words. In Hegel, nostalgia is an interminable danger for the development of spirit, a form of madness which, ever present, threatens to turn consciousness inwards in retreat from the world. For Freud, as he famously wrote in 3 Theories on Sexuality, a finding of an object is always, in fact, a refinding of it, and nostalgia theorists are particularly happy with that quote. They keep mentioning it in their works. As we have seen in Lacan, nostalgia is a universal characteristic of human desire, responsible for the melancholic impetus of death drive in its dual aspiration for a new beginning and a final death. In George Bataille, nostalgia is the condition of possibility for the needs of eroticism to harmonize fundamentally discontinuous and atomized human beings. In Louis Althusser, ideology is placed on an even footing with nostalgia as encompassing the emotional content of the imaginary relation which sustains one's identity. So to bring a cliché to bear, a spectre is haunting continental philosophy. Nostalgia is always just below the surface for these philosophical conceptions of desire. A bruising ideology historicizes this tragic, melancholic, one might say fatalistic notion of desire and subjectivity as running on a nostalgic logic of yearning for a lost object with the wish of self-recovery. This is not to say that these theorists are nostalgic necessarily, but they have a sensitivity to a notion of nostalgia that is intimately tied to a lacking human condition as such. This is why, in the first section, I examine nostalgia retrospectively from its predominant role in contemporary philosophy as a fully assumed image of alienated humanity, back to when the wasting disease was still a medical as well as philosophical novelty for early modern physicians and Enlightenment ideologues. So, in What Nostalgia Was, historian of nostalgia Thomas Dodman writes, quote, "Nostalgia confronts the historian as a historical problem, an emotional disposition at once historically determinate and one that outlived its own conditions of possibility, as it were, to become seemingly timeless." End quote. This historical problem, as I will lay out here, is the early modern development of scientific, philosophical, and poetic understanding of subjectivity from nostalgia's afflicted imagination to ideology's false consciousness. So we'll begin by going into Johannes Hofer a little bit. For Hofer, nostalgia included inconsolable yearning for the spaces of the homeland, which in the 17th century Swiss context included the company of their families and the cattle-calling melodies of the Alpine herdsman, the ronde des vaches. While homesickness existed in many forms long before Hofer's medical dissertation, he acknowledges the Swiss Heimweh and French mal de paix as pre-existing conditions, but it was his clinical invention of nostalgia that for the first time classified homesickness as a pathological case of human experience necessary for medical attention. The only cure for nostalgia was to recognize it as a bodily displacement and close the distance. As Hofer maintained, nostalgia admits no remedy other than a return to the homeland. So nostalgia at this stage is a disease of dislocated space rather than one of lost time, as we might associate it with now. Inspired by Cartesian doctrines in medicine, the pathogenic cause of nostalgia was thought to be sensory stimulation affected by environmental pressures in living space. One contemporary of Hofer's even took this as far as to suggest that the Swiss were more prone to this longing to return to their homeland as a result of them having become used to the thin-aired climate of their alpine country. So he suggested locking them in a room at the top of towers for a while so their bodies can reacclimatize themselves to the simulated air of the mountains. For Hofer, this sensory stimulation took the effect of a literally inflated and disfigured faculty of imagination. As Hofer ruminates philosophically on this issue of an afflicted imagination, quote, Nostalgia is accompanied by various other symptoms of an afflicted imagination, for I do not think it is possible to ascribe it accurately or better to anything else. It is easily clear from that, moreover, that the imagination is affected because men thus oppressed are moved by small external objects, and nothing creates a stronger impression than the desire recalling the homeland. For when that faculty of the mind is indifferent in its normal state toward anything whatsoever, to be moved, to form ideas, it follows entirely that that thing is lessened, if it is aroused towards small things, and if at least they represent the living spirits continually by penetrating the single courses of the brain. Only also they represent an opportunity of forming an idea of a single object." End quote. The delirious fascination with the idea of return to the homeland caused the nostalgic sufferer's imagination to essentially gorge itself on the rest of the body, blocking off the passage of vital spirits to other natural functions of the body, and hence the broad variety of assumed symptoms. For Hofer, nostalgia excites the activity of neural pathways with the rolling repetition of fantasies of return home, and therefore wasting the rest of our physical bodies. Nostalgia is the unremitting excitement of nerve fibers interlinking the deepest part of the brain, allegedly, where lasting impressions of the homeland are accumulated. Nostalgia exists to perpetuate and intensify itself, in his words, as the swollen and disfigured imagination imbues the animal spirits with the rolling repetition of images of the lost homeland, and an intense fever is brought about as a result, and then, in many cases, death, allegedly. In his study of the nostalgia disease and the Enlightenment, a really brilliant study, Helmut Ilbruck writes on the Swiss doctor's strangely philosophical account of the wasting disease. In his words, Hofer's theory of an imaginatio laesa identifies, through the medical term laesa, a loss of function, and that loss is itself due to what Hofer theorizes as an imaginative strength, which, as it becomes stronger in feeding upon itself, also becomes bound and imprisoned. End quote. In other words, Hofer conceives nostalgia as the result of an increase of strength for the imagination, but this strength at the same time spells weakness in the debilitating forms of disease and death. The imagination is conceived as an uncanny resident, both remote from and immanent to bodily mechanism as a remote energy source in the deepest recesses of the brain, recalling the Lacanian definition of extimacy, driving the body to its own self-destruction. As Ilbruck points out, Hofer's philosophical understanding of nostalgia having its causal roots in the desire of an afflicted imagination has implications for the intellectual history of the time. In his words, how is it possible that the association of ideas can also affect pathologies or phobias and preconceptions? An emotively captivated fixation on external objects, central of course to the appeal of the nostalgia disease, was not just of medical interest as a disease to be remedied. Nostalgia forms the backdrop to predominant philosophical anxieties of the 18th and 19th centuries, which had to do with the mental formulation of ideas and their relationship with overactive passions of imagination. The way the fatal disease of nostalgia pulled and amalgamated disparate fields of inquiry, including medicine, insanity, and moral agency, was one of the foundations, I argue, for our historical understanding of ideology as it has developed today. Pathological longing for the lost homeland intensified in the French Revolutionary period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with some death certificates of conscripted soldiers reading "Death by Nostalgia." Homesickness became a serious problem for the levée en masse of the French Revolutionary Army in the 1790s. Up to 5% of the army were thought to have been afflicted by the end of the 18th century. In response to the spread of the disease in their ranks, military doctors drew on a wide variety of methods to isolate and eradicate the nostalgic affliction in their patients, recommending things like scorching their flesh with hot irons or promising to bury them alive in foreign soil, which was particularly traumatizing. It was the military concern about this wasting disease sapping the combat readiness of the mass levy which drew special interest from a sect of French thinkers and administrators of the so-called moral science, the ideologues. So let's pause a moment with them. Coined by French aristocrat and philosopher Antoine Destutt de Tracy in an earlier draft of his Elements of Ideology in 1795, ideology at this early stage was the name of human emancipation from false systems of ideas, a moral enterprise blending sensationalist philosophy, liberal republican politics, and positivistic science. Ideology took precedence as, to quote de Tracy, the greatest of arts, for whose success all the others must cooperate, which is that of regulating society. So nostalgia was becoming such a crisis at this point that the surgeon-in-chief of Napoleon's Grande Armée, Pierre-François Percy, under the influence of ideologue clinicians like Philippe Pinel, wrote of how the physician should treat the nostalgic patient with the following interesting command: grab hold of the patient's imagination and redirect it away from the object to which it is enslaved. I want to return to the motif of violence implied by that instruction. But in other words, in contrast to brutalizing or demeaning patients, burning them with hot irons or threatening to bury them alive, an alternative method of approaching mental illness was developed, which considered that disordered affects generate warped ideas, and vice versa. Ideas can also make you ill. Treatment from ideologue clinicians and surgeons incorporated the sensationalist dynamic between feeling and cognition, and in doing so inaugurated a strange precursor to the 20th century psychoanalytic talking cure. A sympathetic conversation with the patient would take place, in which ideologue, standing in as priest or even proto-analyst, would try to express rather than repress their nostalgic feelings, refitting their disfigured imagination for the good of the nation and the demands of wartime. And they would speak very highly of the tears that would break forth at this point and see that as a success. Curing or indeed overcoming the disease of homesickness, conceptualized as being mired in the backward customs of the past, was recognized as a necessary step to take towards the historical self-actualization of bourgeois modernity. Nostalgia became the discomforting, teething problems of the new communities of the nation-state. Most importantly, it was now a temporal obstacle rather than an environmental disorder, and was increasingly seen as accruing moral defections rather than physical impairment. The daydreaming of the nostalgic became a clinical case study for what was emerging more broadly in modern society, as the faculties of memory and imagination diverged in early modern medical and philosophical literature, and new collective narratives of progressive time set root. As Thomas Dodman argues, nostalgia, in other words, had both a real content and an instrumental raison d'etre. It needed to be invented precisely insofar as it could be cured. Could the same not be said about ideology at its inception in sensationalist philosophy, that a science of ideas needed to be invented as a discrete scientific analysis of the mental and physiological laws of consciousness, insofar as this new, mysterious category of experience could be cured, expressing the inevitable Escher-like paradox of an ideological critique of ideology? It is in Hegel, then, I argue, that we can perceive the movement of ideology between a science of ideas and a false consciousness, as he takes the basis of de Tracy's Enlightenment anxieties to be part of the very process of spirit's homesick tarrying with its recollective knowledge. Indeed, at the same moment that Hegel was poetically expounding on the night of the world, soldiers on the early 19th century front lines who were diagnosed with nostalgia would complain of hallucinating exactly such phantasmagorical objects, severed limbs, expressions of horror, abstracted from an appropriate whole. Nostalgia, from both the point of view of the sufferer as well as the military and moral physicians, appears to foreground a negativity of imagination that is at the very core of Hegel's philosophy of spirit and is tarrying with the structure of feeling of his time. It is here that we return briefly to Napoleon's chief physician's moral instruction of the cure of nostalgia to literally seize control of the patient's imagination. The violence implied in this gesture, while also evoking the mind-distorting effects of false consciousness, upon which the ideologue as healer is supposed to dispel, is extremely suggestive of the philosophical difference between Kant and Hegel on the transcendental role of imagination in human experience. So to be brief, For Kant, our everyday experience of reality is made possible by a spontaneous act of transcendental imagination that prefigures the spatial and temporal arrangement of what is meaningful for us, allowing for his famous argument that conceptions without intuitions are empty, while intuitions without conceptions are blind. So this synthetic activity of imagination stabilizes us. However, as argued by Slavoj Žižek via his reading of Hegel, this mysterious transcendental power of imagination to precondition our sensory experience implies a violence, a disruptive, decomposing, desacralizing negativity, reaching out, grabbing hold, and redirecting the world around us. Hegel's night is the Kantian underworld of a negative and violent power of imagination, where constructive synthesis gives way to primordial dissolution. As Gabriel Trop writes in Poetry as a Way of Life, the imagination as an aesthetic disposition, therefore, not only foregrounds a fundamental negativity at the heart of human temporality, but draws upon this nothingness as the condition of possibility of a form of selfhood that can preserve the past, manage the present, and interpret the void of the future. And despite the association of nostalgia with bittersweet longings that focus on comfort and security, the development of this disease into the psychoanalytic model of desire we know it as today was brought about in this historical nexus of Hegel's night, the homesickness of spirit, and the real violence of nostalgia's naturalization on the battlefields of Europe. For Hegel, reason and madness are not opposites. Žižek makes use of this point frequently. Rather, madness has the healthy consciousness as its presupposition, as Hegel famously wrote. In the instance of nostalgia, madness is a withdrawal into the desire of self-consciousness to assimilate the otherness of the world to itself. Rather than tarry with this alienating substance of the world, nostalgia as a form of madness evades the laboring with our deeper alienation and strives instead to swallow the outside world into an inner simulation of projected fantasies and drives. What ends up happening for the nostalgic subject, then, is a sustained quest for unity that can only use as its material the reality of its own dreams and phantasms, surrounding and ensconcing us into our own makeshift womb as an alien power. The subject is shut up inside itself, communing merely with its interior states. The opposition between itself and that which is for it remains still shut up within it. In his treatise on Hegel's theory of madness, Daniel Berthold Bond writes on the significance of this for nostalgia. Nostalgia, whether qualified as madness or not, is always on the borderline of disease for Hegel. It is not simply a transient turn of mind which distracts us in moments of melancholy, but a way of thinking and feeling which perpetually threatens our whole state of being with the desire for retreat and regression to a simpler, happier world, and a corresponding rejection of the world we happen to live in. Madness is only the most intense and desperate state in which the nostalgic way of being is attested to. In a further resemblance to the Lacanian death drive, madness for Hegel is a tragically preemptive form of healing the wounds of spirit. But this healing hurts, or as we see from military physicians of nostalgia in Hegel's time, can kill, because this gesture of self-recovery, this coincidence with myself, which promises to finally abolish the pangs of the ego, is what is precisely disturbing and agonizing the primordial peace that the nostalgic seeks. So I've reached Žižek, and I'm aware that I may have written too much. In Žižek's political philosophy, melancholia is an ethical practice of disconsolation precisely from this risk of nostalgia. Indeed, as he writes, it is the beginning of philosophy. While ideology consoles and reassures the ever-anxious and afraid knight of the soul with nostalgic images of self-same continuity, melancholy is for Žižek what depression is for psychoanalyst Julie Resch. Trauma that brings us closer to a more authentic expression of human life. Resch condenses the ethics of Žižek's position in two poetic and deliberately open questions. What if, with the unbearable pain, so much of it that you couldn't feel it anymore, you touched the black matter that constitutes the heart of existence? What if, in your numbness, blindness, and paralysis, you resonated the most with everything non-existing? End quote. Almost every reference to ideology in Žižek's entire philosophical corpus touches on this tarrying with numbness, with non-existence, this insatiable and incurable sickness which, rather than slowing and debilitating what makes our humanity conscious and sensible, is in fact solely responsible for what moves and animates us as living, aching, reflexive beings. With ideology, we are not simply dealing with a warped consciousness in need of progressive political guidance, but a black matter of human existence, triggering great pain and which is in constant need of ideology as an effective mechanism of second-hand composure. So whenever I read these, I can't help but feel overwhelming feelings of pity and sadness whenever I read his theory of ideology. I argue that this romantic and deeply nostalgic sensitivity that Žižek poetically inscribes into his critique of ideology is most prevalent in the role he ascribes to the Kantian notion of the sublime, chiefly in Žižek's quite weird assimilation of the Kantian sublime, Lacanian jouissance, and Marxian ideology into one great melancholic ontology. The enigma of the sublime has itself always been a romantic one, corresponding with unbridled emotional sentiment, Gothic motifs of terror and haunting, as well as the long-standing philosophical concern with where the limits of human sensibility end and the dimension of the metaphysical or the divine begin. Now, I might have to go through this in the Q&A because I don't have quite time, so you can ask me about that in a minute, but I might just have to skip ahead a little bit.
You have to tell us what to ask you so you can actually read it later.
Yes. So I'll just conclude. To conclude, without this background of the double movement of nostalgia and ideology in philosophical considerations of modernity, certain statements on the romantic inscrutability and immutability of ideology that have become commonplace in contemporary Žižek-inspired theory would not be possible. As Rebecca Comey in Morning Sickness writes in quite a fatalistic style, ideology arises from the very structure of experience. It expresses the opacity that binds us together as human. Consciousness is nothing but its own non-coincidence with itself, a repetitive struggle to define and position itself in a world to which it will not conform. This passage is very beautiful, but I think an urgent question to start with Žižek today is how to finally confront and avoid the tragic fatalism of the nostalgic drive in his theorization of ideology, the conservative, extra-ideological cul-de-sac of the by nature, always already ideological subject, that the human is simply an ideological animal. And you'll probably have more questions, so I'll answer them in the Q&A, but thank you. Thank you very much.